Welcome to the Explainer. You know, when we think about the history of artificial intelligence, it's incredibly tempting to just imagine this straight, upward line of inevitable progress. But the reality? It's honestly a lot more like a documentary-style roller coaster. We are talking about massive cycles of public hype, staggering amounts of military funding, and then devastating crashes that literally wiped out research for decades at a time.
Just to give you an idea, back in 1954, newspapers were running these absolutely wild headlines like, "Robot brain translates Russian into King's English." People genuinely believed we were on the absolute brink of thinking machines. It really shows just how early and how intensely the media exaggeration and the AI hype cycle actually began.
So what happens when all that intense hype hits a brick wall? We get what's called an AI winter. This is a period where funding and interest in artificial intelligence completely dry up. The term itself was first popularized in 1984 at the annual meeting of the American Association of Artificial Intelligence. Leading researchers like Roger Schenck and Marvin Minsky, who had actually survived an earlier funding crash in the 1970s, warned the business community that their enthusiasm was spiraling out of control. They predicted this disastrous chain reaction: pessimism in the AI community, followed by pessimism in the press, and finally a severe cutback in funding that would just end serious research altogether. Today, we're tracing this entire boom and bust journey. We'll start with the AI hype cycle, explore the early dreams and setbacks, endure the devastating first AI winter, examine the sudden collapse of expert systems, and finally arrive at the modern AI spring. Part 1. The AI hype cycle, a historical pattern of booms and busts. Let's dive right into the cyclical nature of AI development. The history of this technology is defined by a really harsh contrast between researcher hype and the actual technological reality on the ground. If you track the ambitious golden years from 1956 to 1974, you'll see programs doing amazing things like solving algebra word problems and learning to speak English. But that golden era was abruptly followed by the devastating first winter of the 1970s, and later a renewed second winter that hit hard in the late 1980s. Part 2. Early dreams and setbacks, overpromising the future in the 1950s and 60s.
AI initially developed at a remarkably rapid pace. There was immense optimism, especially after Alan Turing arbitrarily set a standard for a thinking machine in the 1950s with his imitation game. So, during the Cold War, the US government and the CIA started pouring money into machine translation. They expected flawless, instant translation of Russian documents. But the reality? Well, it was a massive disconnect. The famous 1954 Georgetown IBM machine was really just a highly curated demonstration. It only translated 49 pre-selected sentences using a tiny 250-word vocabulary. To put that in perspective, humans need a vocabulary of about 8,000 to 9,000 words just to comprehend written texts accurately.
And this brings us right to a core technical flaw they ran into: the common sense knowledge problem. There's this apocryphal but very famous example of early machine translation where the phrase "the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak" was translated into Russia and back. It supposedly came out as "the vodka is good but the meat is rotten." It's funny, but it highlights a huge issue. Researchers entirely underestimated the profound difficulty of word sense disambiguation. The machine literally had no idea what the sentence was actually about.
So naturally, this lack of progress had massive financial consequences. Let's follow the money for a second. By 1964, the National Research Council formed ALPAC to investigate what was going on. In 1966, their report concluded that machine translation was actually more expensive, less accurate, and slower than simply using a human translator. The fallout from this was brutal. The NRC cut $20 million in support, careers were destroyed, and research effectively came to a standstill.
Then came an additional massive setback in 1969. Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert published a book called Perceptrons. It heavily emphasized the mathematical limits of single-layer neural networks. Now, because nobody at the time knew how to train multi-layered networks, a vital technique known as backpropagation was still years away from being discovered. This single book essentially killed mainstream funding for neural networks for years. Part 3. The first AI winter. The harsh realities of the 1970s. This ushers us into the 1970s, and the optimism was completely gone. The fundamental issue was a severe lack of computing power, meaning algorithms that worked perfectly in the lab just ground to a halt on real-world problems. In the United Kingdom, the crash was triggered by Professor Sir James Lighthill. In 1973, he delivered a totally devastating report to the UK Parliament. He criticized the utter failure of AI to achieve its grandiose objectives. He specifically highlighted the combinatorial explosion problem, basically pointing out that AI was only successful at solving simplified toy versions of problems and became mathematically impossible to run in the real world. This single report led to the complete dismantling of AI research across the entire UK.
Meanwhile, over in the United States, the collapse came directly from DARPA. Historically, DARPA funded brilliant people with very few strings attached. But the 1969 Mansfield Amendment changed the game, requiring DARPA to fund specific mission-oriented research. And honestly, they just lost patience with researchers who were caught up in a web of increasing exaggeration. A prime example is the Speech Understanding Research, or SIR program. DARPA wanted a system that could respond to voice commands from a pilot. Instead, researchers at Carnegie Mellon delivered a system called Harpy that only recognized English if the words were spoken in a very specific hardwired order. Feeling completely duped by the overpromising, DARPA outright canceled a $3 million a year contract.
Part 4. Expert Systems and Collapse. The Rise and Fall of the 1980s AI Industry.
We shift now to the 1980s. Surprisingly, the AI industry briefly boomed again. It was saved by specialized expert systems. For example, a system called XCon saved Digital Equipment Corporation an estimated $40 million. And suddenly corporations worldwide were spending over $1 billion on in-house AI. But this boom was destroyed by a fatal hardware shift. You see, to run these expert systems, companies bought these incredibly expensive, highly specialized computers called Lisp machines. But right next to them, powerful and increasingly cheap general-purpose workstations built by Apple, Sun, and IBM were hitting the market. They quickly became powerful enough to run the AI applications, completely destroying any reason to buy a specialized Lisp machine.
This hardware shift triggered the devastating second AI winter. In 1987, an entire $500 million Lisp hardware industry collapsed in a single year. And the software side failed too. Those corporate expert systems proved way too brittle, making grotesque mistakes with unusual inputs, and they were far too expensive to maintain. On a global scale, massive government projects failed simultaneously. Japan's $850 million fifth-generation computer project ended with a whimper in 1992. And back in the US, Jack Schwartz took over DARPA's Information Processing Technology Office, dismissed expert systems as merely clever programming, and cut AI funding deeply and brutally.
The fallout from this second winter was so severe that the very term artificial intelligence became completely stigmatized. As tech investor Alex Castro noted back in 2007, investors were actively put off by the term because it was directly associated with broken promises. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, researchers literally had to use aliases, calling their work informatics or machine learning or analytics, just to procure funding and survive without the toxic label of AI attached to their work.
Part 5. The Modern AI Spring. Has winter truly passed? Let's move to the modern era. Enthusiasm slowly crept back over the years, but the real turning point happened in 2012. A deep learning network called AlexNet won a major visual recognition challenge with half as many errors as the runner-up. This one breakthrough shifted the entire industry toward genuine commercial viability. To understand the sheer scale of the current boom, consider the predictions. $364 billion in tech investment in AI by 2025. It demonstrates an unprecedented financial scale and corporate confidence that we've never really seen before.
And the public adoption? It's just as staggering. When OpenAI released ChatGPT in late 2022, it reached 100 million users in just 2 months. This completely reinvigorated the global discussion on artificial intelligence and its effects on our world.
So why might things be different this time? Amit Ray reflects on this perfectly, stating, AI winters were not due to imagination traps, but due to lack of imaginations. Deep learning with deep imagination is the roadmap to AI springs and AI autumns. Modern deep learning, where machines actually teach themselves to get better at activities, is fundamentally different from those fragile, hardwired, rule-based systems of the 1980s.
Which leaves us with this final thought. As investments skyrocket into the hundreds of billions and the public hype builds yet again to an absolute fever pitch, we have to ask ourselves, are we simply repeating the boom and bust patterns of the past, or has the AI winter truly been banished forever?